So at the present, there are several different levels of interaction that we might examine discretely or separately, starting with the political one, because that is the one that is the most obvious, the most emphasized in the media, and the most conflictual, even though it too is not entirely conflictual. And I could indeed spend the rest of the time lecturing about the recent history and political system of the world in a way which is the way that I view it from what I have studied of history, and it is very revisionist compared to what most people would probably conceive of from their history books and social studies books. But nevertheless, it's what I think is correct, so I will have to state it. And that is that often history books, especially in their use of maps, which is a very interesting part of history books and their studies, historical atlases and so on, they're viewed as nice because you have the thing graphically portrayed geographically, and often students' knowledge of geography is very poor, and so if one can cultivate that, it really helps to get a better grasp of history, to cultivate geography and geographical relationships. But another aspect of maps is maps lie. There's a demonstration in the hall about that on that equal area projection, which has at the bottom some Mercator projections and shows how grossly inaccurate the Mercator projection is, and really very terribly distorting geographical facts. Well, the historical map distortions consist of several aspects, one of them being that empires are always shown at their maximum extent. One of the things as an ancient historian that always drives me up the wall is these maps that show the Roman Empire under Trajan, which shows Iraq and Armenia as part of the Roman Empire. And they were never part of the Roman Empire. Trajan marched in and for all of 2 years occupied those areas. And then when he died, Hadrian withdrew the troops, and that was that. Now, I ask you, if it was a 2-year military occupation of an area sufficient to regard that as part of an empire? If that's the case, we ought to portray the United States at its greatest extent, showing Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama as part of the United States when those countries were occupied by American troops. And yet, that's never the way we view it, see? So there's a very great inaccuracy in that exaggerates the size of the Roman Empire somewhat. And fortunately, other maps exist that don't do that, but nevertheless, that's a very clear case. Now, another case is you have the Egyptian Empire in ancient pharaonic Egypt, say under the 18th dynasty, about 3,500 years ago or a little bit less, occupying Egypt, the northern Sudan, and Syria, Palestine, up to the Euphrates River. And this is portrayed as a map. So with our modern mentality, we think of map, European countries or United States and states on map, effective government, single governmental system, unitary state. And of course, such an Egyptian empire never existed. Egyptian garrisons and governors were never placed in Syria. The Egyptian army simply marched up to the Euphrates in the famous 17 campaigns of Thutmose III and marched back. The kings of the area, fearing that the Egyptians would come back for retribution, sent tribute. So they were tributary states to the empire of the metropole, that is Egypt itself. But they were not part of an empire in the sense of a modern state. And that is not conveyed by the map at all. And it's a terrible distortion that that is the case. Because Egypt never, as an organized kingdom, extended beyond the territory between Aswan and the Mediterranean. That was it. It was the kingdom of Egypt for all of its historical period because it was like an island and it couldn't extend its power anywhere beyond that effectively. Now, this has relevance in the modern world because if we think of ancient empires, Now, even the Roman Empire, which was very highly developed bureaucratically for an ancient empire, where there were actually Roman governors and Roman officials in the various provinces and places, there was effective taxation and so forth, so you could consider it a proto-modern state in those respects. Yet it was far less effective, far less intrusive in private lives than a modern state is. And consequently, again, portraying the Roman Empire on the map has a little bit of element of doubtfulness when you compare that with a modern state, because the two are just simply not cognates of each other, not exactly. So that brings up the question of the modern political arrangements in the world and how they have evolved in recent times.